Okay, this page is a little bit tricky because it's based on this kind of fundamental principle of all turbine engines that's a little counterintuitive and tricky to understand. And that is that there has to be some minimum speed that the engine can run. And here's why that is. The combustion temperature inside a modern turbine engine is in the thousands of degrees. But the aluminum that many parts of the engine are made of could not possibly withstand that temperature without melting. In other words, the combustion temperatures inside a modern jet engine are so high that they would melt the engine itself if some sort of a secret little trick wasn't employed. And here's what that trick is. There is an insulating wall of air between the combustion and the engine wall. And the beautiful thing about this insulating layer of air is that you don't have to pay for it, maintain it, replace it, or anything else. As long as the engine is pumping enough air through, there'll be an insulating wall of air around the combustion. The combustion won't leak out and touch the engine wall, and you can keep operating the engine rather than having it melt as soon as you start it up. There is a little bit of a drawback to this, though, and that is that the engine must be spinning some minimum RPM. It needs to spin at least a certain RPM before fuel can be introduced. And it better keep that minimum RPM for as long as it's running. It better keep that RPM for as long as there is fuel going into the engine. Otherwise, that combustion flame will start to expand, get out, touch the engine wall, and destroy the jet engine. This page acknowledges that. So let's start with the prop times here. And this is actually turboprops. In the Pratt & Whitney PT6 engine of my airplane, for example, I have to use the electric starter to motor that thing up to at least 13% before I add fuel. And the fuel gradually ramps up. And then once that fuel is ramped up to a certain amount of fuel flow, that engine better be up to 50% RPM to engage or to withstand that kind of fuel burn. You need to have a certain RPM for the fuel that's going in. Let's take a look at the values that I've entered. So we're going to take a look at the Lancer Evolution here, the Pratt & Whitney PT6. Auto start fuel engage NG. What this means is you better be at least 13% RPM before you start adding fuel. Idle NG for maximum ITT. If you were at 26% RPM, your ITT or your inlet, the turbine temperature, would hit the limit for this engine. And so you actually want to spin a Pratt & Whitney PT6 quite a bit faster than this. You actually want at least about 50 or 55% RPM to keep that idle temperature down. Because if the engine were to slow down below 50 or 55%, and here if it would get down as low as 26%, although in the real engine, I don't think you would ever want to get down to anything like 26%. You want to be at 50% or above. But if you were to get down low enough in the RPM, the insulating wall of air would break down. There wouldn't be enough air to carry that heat away from the fuel flow. The temperature would elevate and the engine would melt. And so when you are entering these numbers and you want to see a certain temperature in that engine at idle, if you enter a larger number here, well, what that means is you really got to speed the thing up to keep a low temperature. And so you're going to have a higher temperature at any given NG. And if you enter a really small number here, well, that says, hey, this engine does a great job of moving heat out. And so you're actually going to have a lower idle temperature. So it's a little tricky to understand how this all works. But the bottom line is you want to enter the numbers here that give you the idle temperatures that you are looking for in your turboprop. And the smaller the number you enter, that means the better the engine is at moving the heat out. The turboprop engine fuel start intro time, 12 seconds. So in other words, at 13% RPM, we start feeding in fuel and it takes 12 seconds to ramp up to the full idle. Fuel pump advance time is just how quick the fuel can get dumped in as you advance the throttle. Free turbine compressor spool time, that's a ratio. It's how fast the little turbine spins up, ratio to default. And then some propeller pitch rates. Jet times, same thing. Idle N2 for maximum ITT. And I have entered values here. Why don't we open up 737? I'm quite sure that I do have really good numbers for that airplane. And I want to be able to show y'all actual aircraft so you can see what kind of values we should typically use. So for the jet, okay, we haven't entered some values here, but that's fine. For the jet, we've got auto start, fuel engage N2, 22%. And thanks to Dutch Pilot Girl, by the way, for uploading YouTube videos of jet engine starts. It's what lets me get all these numbers just perfect so we can fly the airplane more accurately in the simulator. But at 22% RPM of N2, which is a little core, remember the little core N2 fan is what drives the big N1 fan. And then for some super high efficiency Airbuses, they got 3 stages. They got an N3, a little core. That's N3. That drives something a little bigger, which is N2, and that drives a big fan, which is N1. But anyway, your core better be spinning at 22% before you add any fuel at all to build up that insulating wall of air. The idle N2 for maximum EGT and idle N2 for maximum ITT. So at these numbers, like 34 or 37%, if you were to idle that slow, then your temperature would be redlined at idle. So we always idle faster than these numbers. We better idle faster than these numbers. And so if you see an idle temperature that's too low in the simulator, then that means you need to make the simulated engine not so good at moving air out or moving heat out. And the way you make the engine not so good at moving heat out is you actually raise these numbers, because this is saying, oh, well, you better be really spinning fast to keep that temperature under control. So a little tricky to grasp the concept because these N2s move opposite the temperature you're looking for. But this is an indication of how easily the engine can move heat out without overheating at low speed. Engine start fuel intro time, 25 seconds is what it takes for the 737 to ramp up that fuel flow to idle from the moment fuel is commanded. Fuel pump advance time, I have 3.5 seconds. I'm not really sure that's true. This number perhaps should be 0 or close to it because the fuel pump can pump fuel in there very, very quickly. I'm going to have to talk to my artist about this number because this seems to be high. I bet you this number is very close to 0 in reality. Turbine inertia, what the inertia of the turbine is compared to default. It's just going to control how fast the thing spins up an X-plane on the takeoff go around. Thrust reverser deployment time, okay. And then starter torque is a ratio of max engine torque. That's just going to indicate how fast that starter gets you going. And starter design RPM is a ratio of N2. So in other words, how fast can the engine spin before the starter torque starts to fall off? And then some checkboxes on the starter you can read for yourself. The boost is kind of fun. This is like for World War II fighters. It could boost in water, nitrous oxide if they're racing at Reno these days or something like that. The boost amount, how much throttle you get, and then maybe how long you can run it. So that's the engine screen. But the thing that is really important for you to understand is these modern jet engines need to have a certain amount of RPM to carry the heat away and stop that combustion from leaking out and destroying the engine. And you enter these values here. And these are the values that are going to determine what your temperatures are at idle.
Ready? Yes, okay, 13% NG.
recording. We're low idle right now.
And high idle is when we're gonna feel it,
Coming
right?
up, yep. I'm advancing the propeller. I'm now gonna go to high idle.
Yeah.
Now going generator on. DC power on. It's fine, just keep recording. Alright, bring on environmental controls in a moment.
Move a little quick on it.